Attention is a finite resource. This is true in every domain where human beings make decisions under pressure, but it has a specific operational expression in the Combat Information Center of a warship. A CIC crew managing a complex surface picture allocates attention the way a computer allocates processing power. The contacts that generate the most data, the most movement, the most classification uncertainty, receive the most cognitive resources. A contact that accelerates gets attention. A contact that turns toward the ship gets attention. A formation of contacts doing anything unusual gets attention. A contact that approaches slowly from the bearing that is generating the least other activity. In the final few minutes before the attention-consuming contacts have resolved their tactical significance, that contact gets what is left, which is sometimes very little. The People's Liberation, Army-Navy's gray zone operational planners understood this principle with the depth of an organization that had spent years watching how U.S. warships responded to complex contact environments. They had learned which elements of a radar picture consumed the most CIC attention and which elements were easiest to underweight when the primary picture was demanding. They had built an operation around the specific attention geometry of the scenario they intended to execute, a Western threat that filled the display and an Eastern approach that arrived in the residual cognitive space. At 8:03 a.m. in the South China Sea, approximately 62 nautical miles east of Woody Island in the Paracel Islands chain, the guided missile destroyer was on a northbound freedom of navigation track at 15 knots. The Paracels were a contested chain claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, administered by China since 1974, when PLA forces removed South Vietnamese troops from the islands by force. China's claim was not recognized by Vietnam, by the United States, or by the 2016 UNCLOS Tribunal, ruling that had addressed the South China Sea's sovereignty questions. The U.S. Navy transited the Paracel's approach waters regularly for precisely this reason, to establish through practice that the waters were not subject to Chinese jurisdiction, regardless of Chinese assertions to the contrary. At 8:03 a.m., the westward quadrant of the CIC display was empty. At 8:04 a.m., it was not. __0_0 three contacts from the west, from behind the radar shadow of the Paracel Islands primary feature, emerging at 20 to 22 knots on convergent courses. The CIC's pattern recognition produced the obvious classification within 90 seconds. __1_3 planned warships, a destroyer, and 2 frigates emerging from Woody Island's radar shadow on intercept courses. The combined displacement of the 3 contacts was approximately 25,000 tons. Their combined value in replacement terms was approximately $3.5 billion. At 20 to 22 knots on converging courses, they would reach CPA with the U.S. destroyer in approximately 54 minutes. The CIC crew's attention went west. This was not a failure of training or procedure. It was exactly what any CIC crew would do when 3 warships totaling 25,000 tons appeared at 22 nautical miles on convergent headings. 3 warships at 22 nautical miles required engagement, contact classification, CPA computation, track file establishment, threat assessment, escalation, ladder review. 7 of the CIC's 9 scope operators began working the western contacts within 90 seconds of their appearance. At 8:07 a.m., the eastern quadrant produced its contact. Not 3 contacts, 1. A single contact at bearing 088 degrees, range 11.4 nautical miles, speed 14 knots, course 265 degrees, westbound, approaching the destroyer's northbound track at a crossing geometry. AIS, active, transmitting. AIS, identification, China Coast Guard vessel, hull number 3901, CCG 3901. The hull number was not unfamiliar to 7th Fleet intelligence. CCG 3901 was a Type 818 class mega cutter, 12,000 tons displacement, 4 water cannon systems, a crew of approximately 180, and the specific status of being the China Coast Guard's largest operational vessel, a floating institutional statement about Chinese administrative presence that dwarfed every CCG cutter in any other national fleet. It was also the vessel that had conducted the most documented close approach operations against Philippines Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea in the preceding 18 months, operations that had produced footage of water cannon use, close maneuvering, and physical obstruction that had generated formal diplomatic protests from Manila and public condemnation from Washington. CCG 3901 was not an unknown. It was a known quantity with a documented operational history of aggressive close approach tactics. At 11.4 nautical miles and 14 knots, it was 14 minutes from a CPA with the destroyer that the CIC's attention was not at 8:07 a.m. computing. The CIC's attention was on the 3 planned warships at 22 nautical miles to the west. At 8:09 a.m., the tactical officer noticed the eastern contact. He flagged it to the watch supervisor. The watch supervisor assigned 1 operator to the contact, 1 of 9, and returned primary attention to the western contacts, which were now at 20 nautical miles and had resolved to cleaner classification, Type 05, 2, D lead, Type 05, 4A, port flank, Type 05, 4A, starboard flank. A classic plan intercept formation. The 3-ship geometry of the western contacts consumed 8 of 9 CIC operators' attention. CCG 3901 continued west at 14 knots. CPA estimate, computed by the single assigned operator at 8:09 a.m., 1,800 yards, 13 minutes. The first friction arrived at 8:11 a.m. from the western contacts. The lead Type 052D activated its fire control radar, a specific electromagnetic emission that the EW operator flagged immediately, pulling the tactical officer's attention and triggering an automatic escalation review. Fire control radar in the approach phase of a planned intercept formation was not routine. It was the electromagnetic equivalent of a warship putting its hand on a weapon, not drawing it, but demonstrating that the option was present and was being considered. The EW report consumed 45 seconds of the tactical officer's attention and another 90 seconds of the captain's attention as the assessment and the escalation ladder review proceeded. During those 2 minutes and 15 seconds, CCG 3901 closed from 11.4 nautical miles to approximately 10.8 nautical miles. Its CPA revised from 1,800 yards to 1,600 600 yards. The tactical officer's attention returned to the full picture at 8:13 a.m. The captain had been briefed on CCG 3901 before the deployment began. He did not need the classification elaborated. Quote 3, quote 4. Two tactical problems at different timelines. The Western contacts, dramatic, 3-ship, fire control radar active, were 46 minutes from CPA. CCG 3901 was 11 minutes from a 1,400-yard CPA and closing. The Western contacts were designed to be the tactical priority. CCG 3901 was designed to be the operational reality. At 8:13 a.m., the captain understood the geometry. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 5, underscore, underscore, he said, not dismissively, with the specific clinical assessment of someone who had just recognized that the designed to be seen element and the designed to be missed element had swapped their intended functional roles. The three planned warships had not been positioned at 22 miles to close to 1,900 yards in 46 minutes. They had been positioned to be exactly what they were, 25,000 tons of warship generating maximum CIC workload, while CCG 3901 closed to a CPA that the attention-saturated CIC had been slow to compute. The redistribution took 60 seconds. The CPA computation refined immediately with 4 operators on the contact. At 8:15 a.m., Channel 16 activated. CCG 3901's bridge team transmitted. United States warship approaching Chinese sovereign waters in the CCG Islands area. This is China Coast Guard vessel 3901. You are required to alter course and depart Chinese sovereign waters immediately. China Coast Guard has authority to enforce Chinese maritime law in these waters. Alter course now. CCG Islands, the Chinese designation for the Paracel Islands, the same claim that had no standing under UNCLOS, the same administrative framing that the 2016 tribunal had addressed, the same instruction to depart that every CCG transmission in the South China Sea variants of this encounter produced. The captain looked at the communication officer. Log it. At 8:17 a.m., the fire control radar emission from the Western Type 052D ceased. The EW operator reported it immediately. The emission that had consumed 2 minutes and 15 seconds of CIC attention at 8:11 a.m. had stopped. The tactical officer updated his threat assessment. Western formation. Fire control radar deactivated, downgrading from active electronic threat to passive. The deactivation produced a brief reallocation of CIC attention toward the Western picture to verify the deactivation and update the track files. 60 seconds of attention moving back to the Western contacts. During those 60 seconds, CCG 3901 closed to 8.9 nautical miles. The second friction arrived at 8:19 a.m. from the ship's communication system. 5th Fleet Command's encrypted circuit delivered a priority message. 5th Fleet was tracking the Western plan formation via satellite and had classified the fire control radar activation and subsequent deactivation as a deliberate electronic signal, a provocation and withdrawal designed to produce exactly the attention cycle the CIC had experienced. 5th Fleet assessed the Western formation as a decoy element. 5th Fleet's message arrived 7 minutes after the captain had reached the same conclusion independently. The message required acknowledgement. The acknowledgement required the communication officer's attention. The communication officer was monitoring Channel 16 for subsequent CCG transmissions. The encrypted circuit acknowledgement was drafted in 20 seconds and transmitted. Neither the acknowledgement nor the CCG monitoring was deferred. Both happened simultaneously because the communication officer split the task. The split task produced the acknowledgement 3 seconds slower than an undivided task would have. 3 seconds was not operationally significant. It was the kind of friction that accumulated. CPA CCG 3901, 900 yards, 6 minutes, 900 yards. At 14 knots, CCG 3901 was covering 400 yards per minute of CPA reduction. 6 minutes to 900-yard closest approach. The 12,000-ton mega cutter that had been assigned a single operator for 4 minutes while the Western Decoy consumed 8 was now 6 minutes from a CPA that would place it within operational range of the destroyer's port beam. The helicopter was airborne at 8:20 a.m., climbing to 400 feet and banking east toward CCG 3901's approach bearing. The Seahawk's launch produced 2 simultaneous effects. It added a sensor platform capable of independent classification and documentation of the CCG contact, and it produced a visible signal to CCG 3901's bridge that the U.S. ship had launched its helicopter. A ship that had just identified the decoy and launched its helicopter was a ship whose full attention was no longer distributed by the design geometry. At 8:22 a.m., Channel 16 transmitted again. CCG 3901. Same text, same instruction to depart. The captain looked at the communication officer. Log it. CPAC CG 3901, 740 yards, 5 minutes. The Seahawk reached CCG 3901's position at 8:23 a.m. and established a 200-foot hover 400 yards ahead of the mega cutter's bow. The FLIR locked onto the vessel's deck. 12,000 tons of China Coast Guard infrastructure, its water cannon housing visible on the foredeck, its bridge windows occupied, its hull number clearly readable from 400 yards at 200 feet. The Seahawk's camera documented all of it. The CIWS entered passive thermal track on CCG 3901 at 8:24 a.m. The barrel oriented toward the mega cutter on bearing 088, not engaged. Tracking the simultaneous signals from the Seahawk's presence overhead and the CIWS barrel's orientation told the CCG bridge team 2 things. The U.S. ship had identified the Western Decoy for what it was, and the U.S. ship's full sensor and tracking attention was now on CCG 3901 specifically. At 8:26 a.m., the captain checked the Western formation. Quote, 14, quote, 15. The Western formation had not accelerated. It had been on its slow approach since 8:04 a.m. and remained on that approach. The timeline for its CPA had changed only because time was passing, not because the formation had changed behavior. At 1,900 yards in 40 minutes, it was a background element, tracked, assessed, and currently consuming 3 operators' attention rather than 8. CPA CCG 3901, 680 yards, 4 minutes. 680 yards, 4 minutes. The trajectory that had been building since 8:04 a.m. was approaching its minimum. At 8:28 a.m., the captain made his escalation. Fire control illumination on CCG 3901. The fire control illumination radar activated and directed its emission toward CCG 3901. The same signal that every gray zone encounter had deployed at the critical moment. A directed electromagnetic measurement had fire control precision, not a weapon. A measurement that said everything the escalation ladder needed to say at that point in the encounter. CCG 3901's own EW systems received the emission within 2 seconds of activation. The illumination frequency, power level, and antenna geometry were consistent with the U.S. fire control illumination profile that CCG 3901's crew had been briefed on before this operation, the same profile that had been the final escalation signal in multiple previous South China Sea encounters. The briefing had included what typically followed that signal in terms of adversary behavior change. CCG 3901, speed change, contact decelerating, speed now 11 knots. 11 knots from 14 knots. A 3-knot reduction at 680 yards, CPA, revised the timeline. Not a course change. CCG 3901 was still on 265 degrees westbound, but the deceleration changed the rate of CPA reduction. At 11 knots instead of 14, the final approach geometry stretched. CPA CCG 3901 revised 750 yards, opening slightly. Then at 8:30 a.m., speed now 9 knots. CPA revised 800 yards. The deceleration continued. CCG 3901 was not turning. It was slowing, the specific response of a vessel that had received the fire control illumination signal and was now decelerating through the CPA geometry rather than accepting the minimum the original approach trajectory would have produced. At 8:31 a.m., CCG 3901 reached its minimum CPA 820 yards, bearing 088. The mega cutter was visible through the bridge's port windows at that range. A white-hulled, massive ship, its China Coast Guard markings distinct, its water cannon housing clearly visible on its foredeck, its hull riding high in the South China Sea, morning swell. At 820 yards, the distance between the two ships was close enough to communicate without radio. If the crew had chosen to shout across the water, they did not shout. The Channel 16 broadcast had not repeated since 8:22 a.m. CPA, 820 yards, holding, then 850, then 900. CCG 3901 was decelerating, and its bearing was beginning to drift south. Not a course change that would appear dramatic on the CIC display, but a bearing drift of 2 degrees to 3 degrees southward that, accumulated over the next several minutes, would place the mega cutter south of the destroyer's track rather than on it. CCG 3901 bearing drift southward, range 950 yards. CPA opening at 8:34 a.m. The Seahawk repositioned from ahead of CCG 3901's bow to a lateral position at 200 feet, 200 yards off the mega cutter's starboard beam. The repositioning placed the helicopter in the CCG vessel's visual field from its bridge windows, directly visible at 200 feet at the altitude where the crew on CCG 3901's bridge wing could see the helicopter without optical assistance. The Seahawk's FLIR was recording. The Seahawk's laser designator was available, but not yet activated. CCG 3901, bearing now 096 relative, range 1,100 yards. Opening. At 8:35 a.m., the Western Formation updated. Type 052D course change. Contact altering to 095 degrees. Bearing opening from our position. Both Type 054A flankers also altering course. Maintaining formation with the lead. Western Formation is turning away. The Decoy was withdrawing. The formation that had emerged from Woody Island's radar shadow at 8:04 a.m. that had generated 90-second fire control radar activation at 8:11 a.m. that had occupied 8 of 9 CIC scope operators for 6 minutes, while CCG 3901 closed from 11.4 to 8.9 nautical miles. That formation was now on a course that moved its CPA from the destroyer's position. It had executed its function. It had not been needed for the follow-on phase because the follow-on phase had not achieved its intended minimum, CPA. The Decoy was done. At 8:38 a.m., CCG 3901 was at 1,400 yards and continuing to open. Its water cannon housing, clearly visible at 820 yards, had not activated at any point during the engagement. The broadcast that had made its claim at 8:15 and 8:22 a.m. had not transmitted again. The mega cutter was in a slow southward drift that, over the next 14 minutes, placed it progressively further from the destroyer's northbound track. At 8:44 a.m., CCG 3901 was at 3.1 nautical miles. The Seahawk was recalled to the flight deck. The CIC was quiet for the first time since 8:04 a.m. Not silence. The ambient hum of electronics running. The occasional contact report as the scope operators updated their track files on the retreating Western Formation and the opening CCG 3901 bearing, but quiet in the specific way that a CIC is quiet after a sustained contact management period. The focused, slightly exhausted quiet of a crew that had been maintaining maximum attention allocation for 40 minutes and was now reducing to the standard watch posture. The helmsman had been on course 0 degrees north for the entire engagement, from the first contact at 8:04 a.m. to the final Seahawk recall at 8:44 a.m. 40 minutes. The compass had been on 0 degrees, while 3 planned warships appeared to the west, while CCG 3901 closed to 820 yards on the port beam, while the fire control illumination activated and the CIWS barrel moved and the Channel 16 transmissions cycled. The compass had stayed on 0 degrees, not because the course was easy to hold, because holding the course was the job, and the job did not change because the picture was complicated. 1 CCG Type 818 Class Mega Cutter Primary Approach Contact. 3 planned warships, Decoy Formation, 1 Type 052D, 2 Type 054A, 40 minutes from first contact appearance to all contacts opening, 820 yards, minimum CPA CCG 3901, 1,900 yards, minimum CPA Type 052D decoy element, 0 course deviations, 1 Seahawk launch, 1 CIWS activation, 1 fire control illumination, 2 logged CCG transmissions, 0 responses on Channel 16. The Decoy worked for 6 minutes. 6 minutes in which 8 of 9 CIC operators were working the wrong contact. In 6 minutes, CCG 3901 closed from 11.4 to 8.9 nautical miles. 6 minutes of the designed attention gap produced 2.5 nautical miles of approach. The correction produced the rest. 4 operators on CCG 3901, a Seahawk overhead, fire control illumination, and a minimum CPA 380 yards wider than CCG 3901's approach trajectory had aimed for. The Decoy was built for one purpose: consume enough attention to deliver the main effort to its intended position before the main effort was seen for what it was. It consumed 6 minutes. 6 minutes was not enough. It rarely is when the crew doing the seeing has been trained for exactly this.